ISO is something that can be a little confusing, and I think that's because, from the way I see it, there are three main types of ISO. There's the regular ISO you have in most mirrorless cameras. There's Cine EI that you get in cameras like the FX3, the FX6, or the Ronin 4D. And then there's RAW, which you get in RE, Red, Blackmagic. The way I see it, the differences in each of those ISO types is based on when the data is recorded. So on a normal mirrorless camera, light hits the sensor, that data is collected, you can change the ISO value to get the brightness you want, and then that data is stored to your memory card. Cine EI and RAW work a little differently in that when the light hits the sensor, it is read and recorded from that native ISO. Your ISO changes have no impact on what data is being recorded. The ISO changes in Cine EI or RAW only affect how you preview the image in camera or on your monitor. So in Cine EI, the light hits the sensor, it's read out at the native ISO, and then you can make ISO changes to change how you preview the image, but the file that's recorded is using the exposure of that native ISO. RAW video works very similarly. Light hits the sensor, the data is recorded at that native ISO, but any ISO changes up or down that you make get stored into the file as well. So that way, when you go to your editor, say we recorded at a native ISO of 400, but we previewed at ISO 200, one stop darker, that ISO 200 gets stored with your file. So that way, when you open your NLE, the footage gets imported at the ISO that you previewed with. A lot of cameras have dual native ISO, and there's kind of two versions here. There's the version mirrorless cameras use and the version that cinema-focused cameras use. I'm going to use the A7S III and the FX6 as examples because they both have the same native ISO ranges of 800 and 12,800. On the A7S III, you start at that low minimum of 800, and then you can go up. And once you hit 12,800, then the circuit switches over and you get a cleaner image, and then the camera adds a ton of noise reduction to get an even cleaner picture. On more cinema-focused cameras like the FX6 or the Blackmagic, you have to manually toggle between which circuit you're using, and then each circuit has a range that you can work with, a plus or minus range that you can run the ISO. Using that low circuit on the FX6 as an example, we can start at ISO 800 and then say we want to protect our shadows. We'll go down to ISO 200, reducing the exposure on our monitor by 2 stops, and then we can add more light or change the iris to add light back in, overexposing the image, giving us cleaner shadows, but we do risk clipping the highlights if we're not careful. Changing the ISO when you're shooting in RAW or Cine EI does not have an effect on the clipping point of the sensor. So like we can see here, raising or lowering the ISO affects how bright the image appears, but does not change where the data clips. So in this shot, for example, we were going for a dark, blue hour, early morning look, and we could have achieved that with stopping down the aperture or adding NDs, but both of those would have reduced the amount of light that's hitting the sensor, and the less light that hits the sensor, the more noise there's going to be. Instead, we pulled the ISO down, in this case to ISO 125, on the Blackmagic 6K shooting in RAW. So, because we're shooting in RAW, the sensor records the data at its native ISO, in this case ISO 400, then brings it back down to get the look that we want. In this case, almost 2 stops, we're bringing it down. But because we recorded the data at 2 stops brighter than we're going for, we got a lot more light in those shadow details, giving us much less noise. Once you understand how this works, it's really powerful. You can use a lower ISO to overexpose an image, protecting your shadow details, keeping clean details in the shadows, or you can even use a higher ISO to underexpose an image, protecting your highlights, keeping windows from clipping, while still bringing up the exposure of your image to right where you want it. Alternatively, if you're using like a mirrorless camera or something that doesn't have Cine EI or RAW, you could always make custom LUTs for your camera's log profile that raise or lower the exposure by a stop or 2. Then just load that onto an external monitor and make sure your assist tools are monitoring based off the original log image, not the LUT. That way you don't accidentally clip or lose data. A lot of people talk about exposing to the right, and these tools make it really easy to do that, and for you, your director, your client, to still preview an image that looks the way it's going to in the final. I know that's probably horribly oversimplified, but hopefully it helps you wrap your head around the types of ISO. That's all I got for now. See you later.